Well, good afternoon, and what a day it has been. To this webinar entitled Updated Supply, Demand, Price Prospects for Corn and Soybeans, where my colleague Todd Hubbs and I will try to digest, analyze, and make some sense of the USDA reports that were released today. Just a couple of administrative items. The PDF slides for our presentation are available for the webinar, are found under handouts on your GoToWebinar controls up on the right-hand dashboard. So please make use of that. As always, please submit your questions during the presentation. I don't think that's probably going to be a problem today.
No, there's going to be a lot of questions.
Yeah, I hope so. And our webinar archive, the video today will be on YouTube later today at the address you see on the screen, and then maybe not today, but early next week on FarmDoc at our webinar site. So that's a little bit of administration, and we're going to now talk about old crop information. With all the focus on the acreage, Todd, it's easy to forget that we actually had a grain stocks report issued today as well. June 1st stocks came in at 5202 million bushels, so just a skosh over 5 billion bushels. And the average guess going in was 5332. So as we'll see, for the first time in quite a while, on June 1st, we actually had a bullish stocks report.
We did.
It's almost shocking to experience one. And in fact, the surprise measured by the data we're using of 130 million bushels less stocks than expected was the largest bullish usage surprise and stocks surprise since June of 2010. So it's been 9 years since we've had a usage surprise like this. Now, the question on this particular data point is, does that represent a true usage surprise, or is this just a one-time adjustment in stocks due to the loss of stocks due to flooding this spring? Don't really know, but we just have to take that data as it is and say that basically, as we're going to show, for the first time in a while, we don't have to keep ratcheting down our feed and residual use and the corn balance sheet.
No, we're happy about that.
So we're really happy about that. So with that data on June 1st stocks, we can say that third quarter feed and residual use of corn was very nice at 1128 million bushels. It's 1.128 billion bushels. And you can see that that's the highest third quarter feed and residual use for corn going all the way back to the 2009-2010 marketing year. So a pretty big size number. And the fact that that number it's an applied number, and it's so much larger than we have been seeing for a long time, it really makes you suspicious that there's at least a significant loss of stocks that disappeared and they show up in feed and residual due to the flooding. Maybe 100 million bushels or more based on this data. It's hard to tell. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
No, yeah, when you dig into the state-by-state stocks numbers from March to June, big takeouts in Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, it's probably got to do with losing some stocks in general.
But hopefully we're not over-optimistic on this one. In terms of, there's probably some element of that, but also probably still would be some positive news on usage. So total feed and residual use of corn through the first 3 quarters of the marketing year now stand at 4615 or 4.165 billion bushels, just a little bit below what we had seen in the last 2 marketing years, but above 2015-16. So that's some positive news for corn, although how much of a true bullish surprise on usage that represents for corn will yet to be determined. So where we're at is fourth quarter feed and residual use of corn We need to hit 685 million bushels to reach the current USDA old crop 2018-19 projection of 5,300. And we're just saying, based on the data that we just got, we think that that seems to be the best estimate of where we're heading. So we think for once, we didn't need to keep revising that number down, but would want to tell our listeners that we'll have to really pay close attention to that SEP 1 number and understand the possibility that if this was a one-time adjustment due to flooding losses, that might see a somewhat of a bearish surprise when we get the final stocks number, as it implies for feed and residual, because this certainly has the appearance of at least a little bit of an outlier.
A little bit.
Okay. Soybean stocks came in at 1790. The average guess was 1861. So when you put that in historical perspective, it's really interesting. I mean, nobody's really talking about it, but that was a big bullish surprise on soybean usage and residual component. It's not a huge number on the balance sheet. Maybe, might make you change your residual number some based on that number. But basically, there's enough volatility. We're just going to kind of stick with our old crop usage numbers, as you'll see later on. Okay. So that was just a quick run through of what's in the stocks report. Now we get to the really big stuff.
Yeah.
The USDA released earlier today their annual June acreage report, and there's a lot to go through. I'm going to kick up the first part and then turn it over to Todd for some more detailed projections. We want to start with some really interesting context for the USDA numbers. And that's really what I'm going to talk about, to try to frame as we work our way to the corn and soybean new crop balance sheets. The USDA report today indicated total principal crop acreage of 309.3 million acres, which was down a little bit over 10 million acres from last year. 10 million acres. So total crop acreage is down 10 million from last year, a big number. You see, we have some numbers for CRP and prevent plant, to give an idea of where we're at in terms of what we call the total acreage pie. Obviously, the prevent plant total, there's a lot of uncertainty of where that's going to end up with, but we still think that's a reasonable estimate. So kind of key theme number one, as we think about acreage for corn and soybean, is that there was a big decline in principal crop acreage.
Yes.
A little over 10 million acres. So keep that in mind. And where were those declines occurring? Well, the two biggest ones were in South Dakota. Notice principal crop acreage down 2.1 million, and in Texas a little over 1 million, and then kind of scattered. But the Great Plains were really reducing principal acreage throughout, and then as you went through the heart of the Corn Belt as well, but the magnitudes didn't tend to be quite as big as they were in the Great Plains. So that's the overall context of a major drop in principal crop acreage. So how did we end up with the corn and soybean acres that we did?
Indeed.
This is a really dramatic chart showing principal crop planted acreage changes for 2019 compared with 2018. And the big story here, in particular, compared not only to last year, but relative to those intentions in March of this year, was the stampede of soybean production out the door. I mean, we're showing on a year-over-year basis that soybean acreage is down about 9.1 million acres. We also saw some declines scattered through wheat and sorghum. But if you want to know why principal crop acreage is down, just look at the blue bar for soybeans.
That's it.
That's by far away. That all didn't just disappear. Clearly, some of it moved to corn. And on a year-over-year basis, this report indicated that at least intended corn acreage, and I'll repeat that, intended corn acreage. Should I do it a third time?
Go ahead.
Intended corn acreage showed an increase of 2.6 million acres. So that's kind of theme number 2, was the stampede out of soybeans this spring. It seems to us the explanation is that the collapse of the trade talks earlier this spring as we headed into the planting season, I think had a major impact on acreage decisions compared to our baseline in March.
That's right.
Okay. The third theme that we want to present that we think is absolutely critical to understand and to try to properly interpret the acreage numbers that the USDA printed today is contained in this chart from the USDA's executive briefing today. We have relabeled it slightly. Their title was "Percent of Acres Remaining to be Planted." We know that our friends at the USDA would never put in the modifier that we did, but we think this is absolutely right. This is the wild card for acreage and production moving forward. So let me explain for a minute. When the USDA in June does their acreage surveys, roughly in the first 2 weeks of the month, there's always some corn, soybean, cotton, other crop acreage that is not planted. It is instead still to be intended. So look under the column for 2018, that indicated in corn that there was 1.6% of the intended acreage in 2018, in June of 2018, that hadn't yet been planted. So, and you can see that if you go back even further, it generally is below 2%, which makes sense in June, right?
In a normal year, it does.
Yes. So that's kind of, the norm is 2% or less. Look at 2019. The USDA rounding slightly, said that roughly 17% of the total acreage that farmers intended to plant corn, that's that 91.7 million acres that shocked everyone, including Todd and I.
I was shocked.
I think the word Todd used was gobsmacked.
Yeah, and a few other choice words that we won't discuss here. Yeah.
So 16.7% of 91.7 million is 15.5 million acres. So as we go through the rest of the presentation, this is absolutely essential to understand that there's 15.5 million of that 91.7, and that math is very straightforward. That's what the USDA is telling us, that was intended but had not been planted yet, basically as of mid-June, early mid-June during the survey period. That's a enormous potential swing factor in acreage. Secondly, related to that point is that the USDA, when they send out these surveys, they do not explicitly ask farmers, what is your planted versus your unplanted acres in the form of prevent plant? They just ask, what do you intend to plant and what still remains to be planted, with no guidance about how you report your prevent plant acres in your answers. That's just the nature of the beast. That's the way they've always done it. And then they true up to the FSA acres when they start getting those, typically up to a percentage of the total in October. That's when they get prevent plant. So that's essential information for trying to interpret 91.7 million. We have 15.5 million acres that probably includes a bunch of prevent plant.
I would have to assume that.
And the way Todd and I like to think about that 91.7 because of this wild card is that 91.7 is the absolute upper bound that you should consider for corn planted acreage this year, and that there's a much more reasonable expectation is that true planted acreage is somewhere below 91.7. And we're going to go through our logic, and you can agree or disagree with it, but we'll show you our logic of how we interpret it, given this unprecedented, basically uncertainty about what is actual corn plantings. Think about this. Another way to state it, in 2019, the percent of corn acres remaining to be planted during the June survey period is 10 times normal. 10 times normal. 15 million acres is a potentially huge swing from what was reported today, given their system and where we might actually end up. The story is even more dramatic on soybeans. Now, because of double cropping and later planting, you can see that the amount of soybeans that are unplanted but intended to be planted during the June survey period probably averaged around 10%. It was 8.5% last year. Look at that number, 41.2%, Todd.
Massive.
That represents 33 million acres. 33 million acres are out of that 80 that the USDA reported for soybean planted acreage during the survey period was unplanted. I mean, it's a number that is really, truly difficult to get your mind around. So it's no surprise then that when you look at these kinds of numbers, and they're really no big surprise if you think about it a little bit, knowing how extraordinarily late the planting was this year, moving so much of the potential planting based on what we know from the weekly crop progress reports into June, that it's not really a terrible surprise that this particular report, just simply can't be considered as with the normal accuracy. And you can't just accept the numbers without some careful interpretation. And we think this is also terribly significant. Final point that I want to make is that the USDA, NASS, announced that they're going to do a very large-scale re-interview or resurvey of practically the entire Corn Belt in July, and those results will be reported as a part of the August crop production report. I mean, the NASS statisticians, who are excellent, they have a tough job to do. They know that the June survey has, potentially very large errors because of those unplanted totals. So they're going to go back in and do some significant resurveying and reporting that in August. So, boy, that August crop report is going to be a big one this time, because we're going to get that August crop production report with these resurveying on acreage is going to be, in my opinion, what we would normally get in June.
I think so too.
Those will be what we'd effectively
the
call
1% kind of 1.5% kind of error numbers we normally see.
So I've been on my soapbox long enough. I'm going to turn it over to Todd.
I'm going to talk about corn and soybean acreage in a little more detail. Like Scott said, 91.7 million acres of corn supposedly intended to be planted. And what we did see is USDA up the spread between planted and harvested to about 8.1 million acres. I think that's right in line with what we might see. It could be even more with the kind of corn planting we've seen this spring.
Right.
The guess from the trade was about 86.6 million acres. It's down a little over 1 million acres from planting intentions, but well outside what normal expectations were, and hence you've seen corn prices do what they did today. Now, I might think that's a little bit of overreaction when you start thinking about what these numbers truly represent. But we'll see as we move through the summer. But 91.7 million acres, a real shocker, no doubt about it. When we go state by state, we're up 2.57 million acres from 2018. And what we saw was out in the plains a bit, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, sort of the western Corn Belt, with the exception of South Dakota, which I don't think this is much a surprise based on the weather they had through May and into early June, have increased corn acres. Illinois is 11 million acres, no change. And Scott and I have discussed that's a real head scratcher. Those of us in Illinois, when you go north of here, it's a mess. And the idea that we only lost 200,000 acres from the March intentions in Illinois seems far-fetched. I don't know what you think about that, Scott. But
well, I kind of now look at these numbers, and I don't take them quite literally.
No,
I don't honestly. I'm not saying that USDA did anything wrong, but I think if you understand how the survey was conducted, that I believe that these reported numbers include a large amount of prevent plant.
And I think that's true for the whole Eastern Corn Belt. When you take Indiana, even Ohio down 200, I still think they're lower than that.
Yeah.
And Michigan as well. So we'll see as we move and see the resurvey and what they come out with in August.
Right. I think in August we'll know a lot more.
We'll know a lot more. When we look at planted acres minus June acreage, traditionally the planted acres is less than the June acreage number over the last few years, except they were almost spot on last year with 1,000 acres. This year, I expect that number to be quite large as well before it's all said and done. We could actually see an all-time record change between actual planted and June acreage. If you're tuned in next year for this, we're going to have a bar that goes down significantly from where it is now. I already mentioned they've upped it to 8.1 million acres planted and minus harvested, and that could get even worse. If we have seen the kind of acres that have gone in that the USDA is talking about in this 90.7, it's been planted in some pretty rough conditions. I forgot to mention it, and I want to mention it now that we're thinking about it. This big shift in acreage into corn and well out of soybeans, it brings into question, did the actual base for corn acreage expand? And I'm of the opinion, I think Scott is as well, that it did.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about what this expanded base of corn acreage might be. We're sort of linking on 95 million acres, which would be 2.2 million above March intentions. That may be too high. That's a lot of acres, but it feels like as we move through the spring with the trade negotiations falling apart, there's a big shift into corn, and we might have seen the actual base expand over the last few months. Corn yield, you can throw this trend out, and we're talking about a trend of 175.4. If we did 175.4 this year, I will fall out of my chair. We're nowhere close to that, in my opinion. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the balance sheet. And here it is. So we're looking at 18-19 in the first two columns. We're basically converged on the USDA's numbers. I think they're good numbers. We're looking at a 360 average price for 18-19. The only place for concern for use in 18-19 is exports. We've seen it weaken quite a bit. I think we still might hit 2.2 billion bushels of exports, but don't be surprised if we lose 30 to 40 million out of that before it's all said and done. Competition out of South America has been severe. What you're seeing in the third column here, this is what USDA said in June. We're not going to change them. We'll let them change it when it comes to July. What we're looking at over here is a forecast for 1920 with a 6 million acre loss from a 95 million acre base. So what we're talking about here is we think the actual corn base expanded, but we still think there's a significant amount of prevent plant out there for corn. We got a 6 and 8 million acre scenario from the 95 base. Now that 95 base may be too high
because notice that would be the second highest since the mid-90s.
Since the mid-90s. But it does seem to us that that's what we're looking at. If we do a 6 million acre loss from 95 and an 8 million, 6 million acre loss from 95, 89 million acres with an 8.1 difference, 80.9. I'm still at 166 yield. I know the USDA is at 166. If this expanded corn acreage went in, mudded in through the June 20th, like a lot of people are saying, that 166 yield seems a bit of optimistic to me, if that's truly what happened. Scott,
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way I look at it is undoubtedly to some degree, you have to read the acreage report today as having a bearish bias for corn.
It does.
And it tells us that the base of corn planting increased over March.
Right.
And so, we kind of have to guess at what that was. And so when we use 6 and 8 million acre PP assumptions, we're also saying that probably total prevent plant from what we expected a few weeks ago is smaller. That's what
right.
The report probably tells us as well.
Yeah.
So those things come together to have us raise our planted acreage estimates higher than they were a few weeks ago. And so that on its face is bearish. But the other hand is this means that we planted a whole bunch of corn after Memorial Day in what is widely reported to be really poor conditions.
Yes.
And so, we're talking as much as 20, maybe 25% of the corn crop, went in super late under very poor conditions and is really struggling to catch up. So that's going to be a significant matter as we proceed through the rest of the summer. That could be a yield drag even over and above what we're seeing here.
Yes. And that's not saying we could not see 10 plus million when it's all said and done. We could.
10 million acre loss from the 95.
From the 95.
Yes.
I think that's more than feasible, but under the scenario 6 and 8, under those scenarios with that kind of yield, we're looking at about a 15.6 billion bushel supply for the 6 million acre loss, about 15.3 for the 8 million acre loss. That takes us sort of out of the rationing phase of consumption for the most part. So we see use, particularly in ethanol. If you guys have been following what I've been doing the last few weeks, I saw rationing in ethanol because corn prices sort of took it out, and more severe rationing in exports. I think that's sort of out of the question if we planted 89 million acres with a yield in the mid 160s. So we got a use of about 14.2 billion bushels, which puts us about 10.4%. In my opinion, that's about a $4 corn price, seasonal average. Now, under the 8 million acre loss, of course, supply is lower. Imports, about 50. They might be a little higher depending on what they do in the Southeast, but I think that number is pretty safe under these kind of supply scenarios. 15.3 billion bushels of production. You'll see a little bit more rationing in exports, I think, under that kind of scenario with an additional 2 million acre loss, which puts us at ending stocks to use of about 8.6, which I think you're starting to see a little bit of strength in the price, 450. Now, having said all this, this is Scott and I when we're thinking through these base case scenarios. If the 90.7 is right, 91.7, sorry. If the 91.7 is right, what we're seeing today in the corn market may make a little more sense. I still think, though, if the 91.7 is right, the yield potential's down significantly, very significantly, based on the kind of corn that went in. Okay.
Yeah, the other point I wanted to make on kind of context for this is our thinking is that, okay, if the base for the intended base of total corn planting was 95 million, well, why did we report 91.7?
Yeah.
Okay, and the reason is that we're just like everybody else guessing how much prevent plant does the 91.7 represent. And basically we split the difference. We're guessing that some farmers included that in their survey responses and some didn't. And so that's why, if every farmer accounted for the amount of prevent plant that we still think is out there, then the USDA today would have reported 89 or 87 million acres instead of 91.7.
Right.
And so that's how, we interpret what's going on. What we're essentially saying, due to no fault of the USDA, that the nature of the survey means that there's prevent plant in those intended 15.5 million acres that's going to show up when we get to August.
Yeah, and the question is how much.
Yes.
And
there's a large scope there.
Yeah.
Do not miss that 15.5 million acres. What we're putting up there could be conservative.
I think it is conservative, but I understand why other people would disagree with that.
Yeah.
If we're sitting on 15.5 million acres, we got past June 5th or even close to June 15th. Planting corn this late, I think a lot. We'll see in August, but
right.
I think we're going to find out that this number, this 91.7, is the top at best of the corn acres.
And we think that it's actually well above what we'll be finding.
I think that I still believe that. Soybean acreage, the 80 million acres of soybean planted.
Woo, what fireworks here.
Yeah, bullish for soybeans. Average guess was 84.3 million acres. That's 4.6 million acres less than the March intentions. And when you look at state by state, everybody got out of soybeans this year, Scott, from last year, with huge shifts up in the Dakotas, 1.25 million acres in South Dakota, 1 million acres in North Dakota, 900,000 in Minnesota. Everybody ran away from soybeans this planting season. That's where you get that 9.156. Now, having said that, there was still 33 million acres left to plant.
Just a hard number to get your mind around.
It's really hard to wrap your mind around that and what it means. Do I think a lot of soybean acres have gone in the Eastern Corn Belt this week? I do. I mean, if you look at the progress report, we still had, 13 million acres to plant in the Eastern Corn Belt as of last Monday.
So, we're getting pretty close to July
1st. So the question really is 80 the top?
That's what
I would think so.
We think it is the top.
I think it is. And because there's just a lot of soybean. I was thinking maybe we would see after the MFP announcement thing, a shift out of corn into soybeans as the planting got delayed. I think it's obvious that didn't happen.
It did not.
And so the shift's not on. So at 80, with an expanded prevent plant in soybeans, if you thought 5 million acres, which I think is a safe assumption, we could be talking 75 million planted acres of beans or lower, Scott. It could be a lot lower.
We just got to always keep your mind focused on the fact that we started during the survey period in the first half of June with 33 million acres unplanted.
Unplanted. When we look at final planted acres minus June acreage, traditionally, there's a little bit of a pattern there, but we've seen soybean acres come up in a few years. This year, I think you're going to see a big downward shift in soybean acres from the June estimate. Now, how big that number is, like Scott and I said, the uncertainty is massive. Acreage uncertainty this marketing year is just huge.
I mean, it really is off the charts compared. We're giving you our best guess of how we think about and interpret these, but we can't emphasize enough the off the charts uncertainty about the acreage numbers that were released today.
Expects extreme volatility this summer in the corn and soybean markets. I believe we're going to see some real movements. When we look at planted minus harvested acre of soybeans, this year, we're about 700,000 acres. We'll see how that turns out. I think that number could grow. We could see it go over 1 million, but for right now, we're just going to stick with that. In the yield, trend of 495 with our little quadratic curve here. I've been fading soybean yield for 3 weeks now, and I've upped the fade even more this week. There is just Well, we were just talking about the millions of acres that are going to be planted, basically like double crop soybeans. And so when we think about where yield might be, we're well below this number, the trend number. And I'll talk about that in detail. We look at 1819 USDA in the forecast. We're there with them. I think that export number is pretty safe. We could see it fade a little bit. I think the crush is going to be right at about 2.1. I don't think you'll see much wiggle room out of the 1.07 billion bushels carry out from the 1819 marketing year. Third column's the USDA's June forecast. And of course, I think their numbers will come down on the acreage when July gets here for sure. Right now, we're presenting two scenarios for the 1920 crop. One is no acreage change, or the 80 million acres that USDA reported in the June acreage report, which I think we both consider to be a bit of a top. If there's 79.3 million harvested acres, which is what USDA reported, we've got yield at 45.5 for the reason I said before when I was talking on the yield slide. Just a tremendous amount of beans planted very, very late into very poor conditions. And it could get worse. It's hard to say right now. We'll see as we move through the summer. But with that, and with these kind of beginning stocks, we're carrying in over 1 billion bushels. We're looking at 4.7 billion bushels of supply in 1920. I've got crush where USDA has. I think that expansion's there. It may be a little weak. We may see 5-10 million bushels of wiggle room in crush, but that's not going to save us. Exports, I've been about 150 million bushels below USDA under the current trade scenario, and that could all change this weekend for the 15th time.
Maybe 20th.
Maybe the 20th. But I think 1.8 billion bushels is a nice estimate for that. It could be lower, particularly with the demand destruction we've seen from the hog herd in China and the spread into Vietnam and the kind of crops we're seeing in South America. So we'll see how it goes as we move in 1920. I see some expansion, but it could be weak. Seed and feed about 130. So we're looking at a total consumption of a little over 4 billion bushels, which puts us back down to ending stocks of 680 million bushels. Now, that's nothing to write home about, but that's a lot better than over 1 billion, which would put us at a stocks use of 16.8%, which I feel is about an $8.50 cash price. Now, that's under the current acreage that USDA presented. If we thought we lost another 5 million acres due to more prevent plant, which I don't think is unreasonable at all.
No, I understand. The way that I like to think about it, you had 33 million acres unplanted during the survey period that ended in roughly the 17th of June.
Yep.
The right question is, how many million acres out of that 33 are not going to get planted and PP? It would seem like it would be a fairly substantial number.
I think 5 million's probably the minimum, but it could be less. I know people are planting.
Right.
I do know that.
But it's important to remember how much we started with having to plant.
Yeah. So under that scenario, we're looking at about 74.3 million harvested acres with the 45.5, which puts about 3.4 billion in production, which puts total supply, if you keep the carry, at about 4.47 billion bushels. I don't think that changes the use pattern at all, hardly. These things are pretty locked in my opinion. So we're still at the same consumption of well over 4 billion bushels, but that would bring ending stocks down below 426 million bushels, which is something we're more used to, not over 1 billion, which would be nice, which puts us at about a 10.5% stocks to use. In my opinion, that's a 930 average cash price for beans. And it could go higher if those acres, the idea of, it seems hard to wrap your mind around the idea of us only planting 70 million acres of beans, but it's feasible. It's feasible.
Yeah, there's that much uncertainty right now.
Just a huge amount.
What I find most remarkable in looking at these balance sheet projections is that the combination of the stampede out the door this spring away from soybean acres, which reduced the total base of intended soybeans, plus what Mother Nature appears to be doing on both the acreage and likely yield side, means in 1 year, it's not unreasonable to project that we're going to have gotten out of an extreme surplus situation in soybeans that I thought would take us many years to get out of.
No, but it took one heck of a year.
Well, it was.
Let's not forget that. This has been one for the record, and we're not done with it. We're right in the middle of it, so that's something to keep in mind. Well, that's it for this presentation. Oh, good. We got time for questions. You're going to want to tune in for the next webinar, folks, because it's from the August production report. And based on what we just said, there's going to be some fireworks in that one, maybe. So we'd really appreciate you tuning in on August 13th for our next update on the corn and soybean markets this marketing year.
All right, we're ready for questions. I know we went a little longer than we usually did, but we knew that just getting through everything would take a few minutes longer, but we'll get as rapidly as we can through as many questions as we can. Okay, question, where are all those PP acres? Anecdotally, it seemed like mudding it in until June 20th was the road more traveled. And, we don't disagree with that statement. It's only kind of a magnitude. We would expect the biggest chunk of those PP acres to be in the Eastern Corn Belt.
A huge amount.
And, we've come down, and based on today's report, we've come down quite a bit in terms of our current prevent plant acreage projections of between 6 and 8 million acres. I'm still saying you got to pay attention to the 15.5 million acres that were hanging out there. There's still it's not out of the question yet that we could have 10 million acres prevent plant.
I don't think so.
And I still think 6 million is the minimum when all the shouting's done and we get the proper accounting for prevent plant acres.
I think 6 is the bare minimum, but we'll see.
Okay. Good question. Why would today's report not capture the bigger base in corn acres? Excellent question. I'll cover that again if I didn't explain it well enough, and jump in here, Todd. Because when the USDA surveys farmers for the June acreage report, they don't ask them explicitly to account for prevent plant acres. So we don't know whether farmers were putting any prevent plant acres into accounting for them when they reported intended and actual acres to the USDA. And so our best guess is it was partial accounting. And so if you think that the true base of corn planted acres like we do now is 94, 95 million acres, the 91.7 accounts for some reporting and accounting for prevent plant in what was reported to farmers. And the rest, we believe, is still buried in that 15.5 million acres that's in the intended category.
Right. If you're thinking about the survey window and what farmers were having to report, it could vary place to place, person to person, of how they reported it. So when we saw the report, the very first thing I thought was, I think the corn base is much higher than what I initially thought. And that's the only thing that came to mind immediately, because this is a huge shift, because the prevent plant's there, right? We just don't know how much got included in the survey.
And as evidence of that, we know that after June 15th, we still had between 8 and 10% of the acres unplanted based on the weekly crop progress surveys. Now, that's not nearly as rigorous, so take that with a grain of salt.
Right.
But there's a big chunk that wasn't planted as of a date that you would think people finally stopped planting corn.
Right.
And so that feeds into our thinking.
Yep.
And so, I know this is probably frustrating for people that the USDA might not provide this kind of context and interpretation, but this is their system. And I think that they are trying to
signal, I guess.
Well, they're trying to signal that they understand and that you shouldn't have the typical faith in the accuracy of those numbers, just simply based on the circumstances when they were surveying farmers. You might say, well, why don't they just survey farmers, add this year, tell us what your prevent plant is? And these survey procedures are set up months in advance, and they would have to retrain enumerators. And it's just, I don't think, really practical for them to do that kind of detailed disentangling of prevent plant and intended and actual plantings. So question was, why would they release numbers that aren't necessarily accurate? Well, I think they would like to know the answer to that, but this is their, well-developed survey procedures. This process winds up for a long time in advance. And we really, standing on May 15th, we didn't know how bad this would be. And that's just not enough time to adjust the survey. No. And we just have to accept that this is the degree of uncertainty given the kind of, what I like to say, black swan nature of late planting that we had this year. It's just the way it is.
Yeah. They're doing what they can with the data they have available to them. And they're going to resurvey.
Right, because that should be a huge signal to the market. That's very important that they pre-announce such a large Corn Belt-wide resurveying that's going to take place in July, that they know the potential inaccuracy in the numbers, but they had to report what they had to report.
Yeah. And here's a question. Aren't they clearly stating we shouldn't trust the numbers given they announced a resurvey at the same time that they released the report? Yes.
Yes, that's exactly the message. And now that I wouldn't use the word trust because that can kind of have a negative connotation. But yeah, they're saying, pay attention. We had 10 times the normal intended corn acres in this, and it could be all sorts of places for error in the way the numbers got reported back to them. That's why we had to do a resurvey. And so that's why kind of the headline for this report that at some points caused corn prices to go down 25 cents. I think that was personally way overdone compared to a real careful interpretation that 91.7, I just don't believe that that's going to be even close to what ultimately is the final planted acres.
I don't either.
Okay, what will soybean production have to look like to get to 500 million ending stocks? Well, let's go back. We have one of our scenarios, right?
Yep.
3.381 million bushels?
3.3. Yeah, you could go about 3.4.
Yeah, roughly some combination of acreage and yield losses to get us down under 500.
Yep.
You have to roughly a crop under 3.4 billion bushels.
That's correct.
With our usage.
Based on our usage. If you use the USDA usage, you could add, there's a little more there. I just want to reemphasize once again, keep your eyes on soybeans because, we are really in an incredible situation here where it is bullish. It is shaping up if the acreage goes away.
Because, we're saying between the first 2 weeks in June, there were 33 million acres of intended soybeans yet to plant. Now, some of that's double crop. I get that. But that is a huge chunk of soybeans. And if it does go in, you're looking at best at double crop yields, which our data in Illinois say should be at least a 25% hit. And I've driven around a chunk of Illinois and looked at some of those small soybeans last weekend, and they look sick. So I just say soybeans is going to be potentially very interesting as we go through this summer.
Both corn and soybean yields. There's a downside to them.
Yeah. Is there a good chance corn yields will be below 166 per bushel? How low could we go? Excellent question. my analysis that I did last week, I think in this kind of year, using, like 1995 as a guide, I think that if things go poorly the rest of the summer, and this isn't even a major drought, just kind of limping along, I don't think it would take much with apparently as much corn was planted in June as was. I don't think, I think that there's probably a reasonable chance ending up someplace in the 150s.
I'm not taking any yield number off the table at this point when we're getting down. Do I think we'll go below 150? No, I don't. But you never know. We're well behind on growing degree days. A lot of this corn went in some really wet, particularly in the Eastern Corn Belt, and not mediocre acres, high APH acres. Yeah, it could get 150 is not out of the question.
And I think probably from what I'm seeing people discussing, even on the acres that weren't planted in June, but like in the last week or 10 days of May, I think the big next riddle to solve will be how bad, in essence, are the failed acres within cornfields?
Yeah.
Drowned out, so very poor emergence. Farmers may be going minimum inputs on that late planted stuff. So I definitely would skew the risks of corn yields below 166 substantially more than above 166.
Yes.
That's the way I think about it right now.
Yeah, that's how I feel too.
It says, have we passed the planting window for corn and beans? Could a Central Illinois farmer be listening to this and go jump in the tractor and plant? Well, yeah, of course you could. We're not going to stop you.
No, do what you want. I wouldn't, but that's me.
Because even, you have to always remember at this late date, you have to trade off all of the input costs versus the yield hit versus the maybe substantially higher prices. And so that's not necessarily
and much reduced revenue protection if you have crop insurance.
Right. And now your revenue floor is declining for if you're on crop insurance. So it's I wouldn't say that it's an automatic. My own personal view on these is to hedge your bets. If you're in that situation, think about doing some PP on your soybeans and taking a bit of a flyer on planting them. And I would balance my risks that way.
And I would say this, Gary Schnitke's done a couple of articles on Farm Doc Daily that I think address this really nicely, the trade-offs. And I like this question. Late plant, it leads to late maturity. What does that mean for frost dates? I get this question a lot.
Go ahead.
Well, I think something to pay attention to for corn this year is the conditions and the progress reports as we move through the summer. A lot of this corn, we're looking at pollination early August. We need some heat to even get it there. The fill window is pretty short. If we think we get a frost sometime in early October, the danger is you don't reach black layer depending on what day variety you planted. In a lot of scenarios, we're so far behind on growing degree days. You're looking at black layer late October, early November, depending on what kind of variety you planted. You could be never reaching black layer before frost hits, which causes all kinds of issues with moisture. Drying costs could be through the roof. These are all things that when you're planting this late, you probably need to take into account. I mean, if the Dakotas planted as much corn as late as it sounds like they did, are they susceptible to this kind of problem? It seems that way to me. I don't know about you, Scott.
Oh, absolutely. The analysis I've seen is that anything other than a unusually warm summer is not going to get it's going to put corn planted, from late May forward, basically north of I-80 for sure, and probably some distance south of that, in real danger with just a normal frost date.
Yeah.
And so the frost risk is for a significant chunk of the corn acres, probably someplace in the range of about 40% of the corn acres is going to be, substantially elevated to extreme.
Mm-hmm. If we get a little bit of cooler weather here through July and lose some more growing degree days, and we end up pushing a lot of this late paying corn back into mid-August
or later,
those yields are going to be not good. Your fill window is very small. I think here in Central Illinois, on average we usually have a first frost October 20th, somewhere in that range.
About middle of October.
About middle of October. The farther north you go, the farther forward that moves. So that's definitely a possibility.
That's an agronomic fact that risk will exist unless we start having the kind of summer that gets a lot warmer than it has been for a long stretch of time.
We need a perfect summer.
Yep. Okay. How will USDA report failed acres? Will it reflect in harvested acres? There are plenty of planted acres in southern Indiana where the corn and beans have rotted or washed away. Right. That will ultimately be reflected in harvested acreage. And that kind of question, is like the resurvey results that we're going to get for the August crop production report wouldn't take that into account. I would guess that is probably not going to be known with a lot of certainty till the January.
The January will be hopefully the final word on it. I think the November report will have a really good idea, and the October report a little bit better.
Probably a little bit better, but they have to. And that'll be an interesting point, because if there's all of these, are they going to do some further resurveying to try to get at that exact question?
Yeah, because I think it could be a big acreage number. It really could.
Yeah. So do you have any data on when price kicks in rationing and by how much? Not hard to imagine decrease in production that exceeds estimate of ending stocks without rationing, of course. It's a good question.
For corn?
Yeah, I'm going to presume that's corn.
Yeah, let's go up there, corn sheet. When I think about rationing, when we get down below what I would consider 9% stocks to use, rationing can start kicking in quite a bit. If we lost another even 6 bushels off of this crop, I think you would start seeing it kick in a bit off the 166. It starts in exports, depending on how high the price will go. Most of it will be in the export market. Depending on how high the price will go, it might blend over into ethanol use a little bit, because their margins aren't that great, even though we've seen them crushing at a higher rate the last few months. So yeah, around 9%. I think you're right. That question's right. We could see production shortfall from yield be dramatic and be in severe rationing very easily. I know we talk about this a lot. This feels like a slow-moving train wreck in a lot of ways, and we'll see how it turns out. But right now, it feels like that to me. I don't know about you, Scott.
Well, all I know is that, for those that are thinking that the acreage story is set, I think that's a really incorrect viewpoint, and that the rains and the weather forecasts that we're having right now are going to save this crop and give us another big corn yield in the between 170, low 170s, and beans 48, 49, 50 bushels an acre. I just don't think that's ever going to be realistic for this crop.
I don't either. And here's a quick, oh, we're about out of time. Let's do this one.
Okay.
The drop in corn futures from this report today seems misguided. Do you think the market is misunderstanding the importance of the report and the resurvey announcement? I do. But when you see the headline number like 91.7, it's really easy to react that way. But when you really start thinking of like what we tried to do today, when you start thinking about the numbers, this thing's far from over. In my opinion, I don't feel like the market's been basically pricing in the yield problems we might see in corn either. But Scott, you might have a different opinion.
No, I mean, like we said, we tried to react to the published data from the USDA, I think, and take out what we think you can glean from it. And so that's why we think the base of intended corn acres did expand from March. But, we'll end with this. There's really just two numbers that you should remember and focus on. That's 15.5 million acres of corn intended but unplanted during the acreage survey period, and 33 million acres of soybeans. That's a potential for huge swings in what I think are the more accurate assessments of planted acreage for corn and soybeans that we're going to see probably starting in August.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of speculation between now and the August production report, but I think we're going to find out for certain.
That's right. And just make it clear, when I say that 91.7 million acres on corn is not right, that's not a criticism of the USDA. They're just dealing with the data through their system as best that they can. But I'm just going to come out and say that I don't believe that that's under these extraordinary circumstances what anyone should be cranking into their balance sheets right now.
Obviously, I don't either. So
on that note, we're going to need to finish up. Our hour's up. We thank all of our listeners as always. We sincerely appreciate everybody who tunes in or who's listening to this video. And thanks, and have a wonderful weekend and upcoming celebration of July 4th.